Retro Future.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Bonsert Bokol of Radio Retro Future and the creator of the Association of Ishtar. And today we have another reaction video. But before we get into that, I want to let you know that my new book, Anwin, Adventures in Responsible Doll Ownership, is now in pre-sale on Amazon and goes live on the 4th of January. More on that later, and links are, of course, down in the description. So, today I want to make a reaction video to the library letter, who created a video, Who Put the Punk in Steampunk? Now, for the content of my video, it's not so much a criticism of his. First we need to kind of like touch upon our difference in style. For those new on my channel, I've created a series called the Steampunk Beginner's Guide of a dozen or so episodes explaining the white tapestry that is steampunk, and in that regards I've done costuming conventions, Jeremy's audio dramas, and I have a podcast where I've talked to hundreds of people active in the steampunk scene, be it in costuming, writing, or comics, and of course music. And through these conversations I started writing my own books, like this one, and we now also have a comic for a series called The Association of Ishtar. In my videos and blogs I approach this topic from the creator's point of view, while the latter, as the channel name suggests, approaches it from my bibliophile's point of view. It's mostly a chronological overview of books from the era of romantic futurists to the proto-steampunks of the 70s to about present day. However, it does not include any mentions of comics like the Boston Metaphysical Society, Castle in the Stars, or the Jekyll Isle Chronicles. Girl Genius get a quick slide, but that's gaslight fantasy, and I mention this because he does mention Japanese animation. Video games also get no mention, which is actually more important than a lot of people realize. So this presentation is not so much a criticism, but more of a supplement of things that I think he missed. And I essentially want to answer the question, does steampunk have an identity crisis? But first, let's start with the definition of steampunk. It's a meme that one of the points of being a steampunk is to argue what is steampunk. But, well, I'm one of those horrible people that's going to define it anyway, and I have yet to find somebody who can give me a satisfactory answer of where I'm wrong on this, so... And that said, steampunk can mean one of three things. First, it can refer to the aesthetic that most people are familiar with, be it from video games, movies, or illustrations. The second is the community of costume enthusiasts that you'll encounter on fairs and conventions. And lastly, there is the story genre that we'll be talking about today. Regarding the aesthetic, I want to emphasize right away that steampunk does not have a monopoly on it. As a matter of fact, look at science fiction and fantasy and you'll notice retro-futuristic fashion is well entrenched in those tales as well. These are very important to distinguish. As Letter said, there are books labeled steampunks that are more like fantasies, and no, he's definitely correct. So let me be clear that I agree with assessment that steampunk is an alternate history genre, where steampunk differs from alternate history as how the premise of a story is formulated. Alternate history usually focus on political events, like what if the Nazis won the war. Steampunk, on the other hand, would emphasize the technological aspect, like what if the Nazis invented the nuclear bomb, or in the latter's example, the British Empire. Now, I am also a firm believer that genres come together organically, which means it can appear anytime, anywhere, independent from one another. As I said, I approach this from a creator's perspective and treat genres like specialized toolkits rather than labels. So, where do I believe is the biggest blind spot in this video? When it comes to identity, something that he mentions repeatedly is strong female protagonists. As far as I'm concerned, that's more product of the current year corpo political climate than it is of genre. Just look at Disney's attempts the last 2 decades. I personally cringe at the recollection of sitting in with writers' meetings where fellow writers make the statements that stories must have #female protagonist. After all, it's just a matter of writing a male hero and glaring a pair of tits on them. Well, they don't say it like that, but that's basically what it comes down to. And no, I'm not exaggerating. And as I stated in my video on colonialism, a certain group of people really love to reduce history to the oppressor and the oppressed, which again can be seen across all genres in the last 50 years. Ergo, I reject the claim that this somehow is unique to steampunk. That said, a steampunk version of the past does allow for marginalized groups to be empowered. I certainly have done so with my works, and those who read my short stories might be aware that one of the setting's most powerful corporations was actually run by gay lovers who used their considerable clout to change the perceptions on homosexuality in the 19th century. And for that reason, authors and costume enthusiasts have used similar reasonings to empower their steamsonas. But what sets steampunk apart from other genres? I do not disagree with Ladder on this topic. I do think that he glossed over a number of things that deserve further exploration. First of all, he never mentions the early definition of steampunk, that being cyberpunk in the past. It's the whole reason how steampunk got its name, and it's an aspect of the genre that I had dialed to 11 in my own novel, The Wrench in the Machine. And that brings me to something else. If you know anything about cyberpunk, this title must sound familiar. It's a reference to Ghost in the Shell, and that brings us to what I think is the biggest oversight here. What steampunk excels at is trope stacking, in peculiar historical and pop culture tropes. This is also the source of many inconsistencies between the various works. When talking to steampunk authors, what stands out to me is their love of giving historical subjects a twist. They do this by combining it with modern pop culture, be it aesthetics or stories. These often have references to history, archaic technology, and, well, modern pop culture. Be it the use of steam power and brass, or military uniforms and antiquated scientific ideas like miasma spreading disease, or that space consisted of ether. Aesthetic examples would be steampunk versions of superheroes and comics such as Steampunk Star Wars and The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Other examples would be combining your local history with, for example, ghost hunting, or combining superpowers with the American Civil War. I myself usually start with a history I find interesting and unleash elements of pulp and science fiction on it. Watch some of my Association of History videos if you want an impression. Of course, ghost hunting and superpowers does not really sound steampunk. Well, and that is where the lines start to blur, as Ladder himself said. And this is also where my definition of steampunk comes in. Many an author love the steampunk aesthetic, but have no affinity with history. And that is how you get fantasy with, well, a steampunk skin. However, it doesn't mean that the themes of steampunk cannot shine through in fantasy settings. It's one of the reasons I struggle with the question if the game Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic could be considered steampunk, because it portrays the conflict between progress and tradition so well throughout the plot. Those who know the game that I'm talking about will point out the obvious Edwardian aesthetics and references to that era. People often treat the 19th century as an obvious setting for the genre, but nobody seems to wonder why that is. After all, ask a steampunk creator who influenced him or her, and Da Vinci and Tesla will often come up, neither of which are very Victorian. So what is this obsession with the Victorians and Edwardians? Again, I believe the answer lies in pop culture, or rather the pop culture version of history. When I say, name some Victorian characters, most of you can answer. Frankenstein, Sherlock Holmes, Jekyll and Hyde, Spring-Heeled Jack, Jack the Ripper, Oliver Twist, Scrooge, and of course Queen Victoria herself. Our pop culture is very strongly linked with the 19th century Britain, at least the costume drama version of that past. I mean, ask who Otto von Bismarck is, or what the anti-slavery patrols are, most don't know. But they recall the story of Pinocchio and Alice in Wonderland. Also, did I mention that people love the oppressor-oppressed narrative? Now, there's more to it than that, but I think you'd agree that most readers are more familiar with Sherlock's version of London than the historical one, not to mention what European countries get a mention other than England or France, or how about other eras apart from the Napoleonic age? Now, you might say those eras don't have steam. And that's the reason why I don't like the term steampunk. I prefer this toolkit to be applied to different eras, but for rant on that I'll refer you to a video I'll put in the description. Unfortunately, steampunks in general don't discuss the topic of steampunk very often. Apart from my YouTube channel, there's not that much outreach. The costume enthusiasts are primarily focused on their own communities and rarely look beyond that. Authors of the genre often work in isolation and build their own audiences, and in the worst case they copy what others do without any understanding why the aesthetics are what they are. Steampunk authors are also very omnivorous regarding their inspiration, be it the romantic futurists or anime. This is the reason why those worlds seem both familiar and different at the same time. It's not the themes of technological progress and social change, as it is in my books or the difference engine, but the combination of history and pop culture tropes. Whether these tropes are from science fiction, fantasy, or weird tales has become something of an irrelevance. Does that mean that Gaslight Fantasy and Steampunk are the same thing? No. They have different toolkits, but to the fans of the aesthetic, I frankly don't think they care that much. Long story short, there's a big discrepancy between people who create and the people who consume steampunk. I have not mentioned this on my channel before, but I actually started working on a book on steampunk called Brass in the Era of Iron Age Media. Iron Age is the name given to this period of self-publishing through platforms like Kickstarter, for example. It's my thesis that the steampunk phenomena, as we know it today, emerge from these developments where people can create their own media independent from big publishers. It's a common fact now that certain creators, do I dare mention their names, even from Skyber and Eric July, outperform many of the mainstream publishers like Marvel and DC. This was unthinkable 30 years ago. In that same vein, steampunk should not have been this popular as there is no big companies pushing the genre. Are you aware that Dark Horse has published several steampunk comics? I think self-publishing and the concept of creating your own grassroots media through social networks and crowdfunding are very important stimulants for this phenomena. It also means there is no central driving force. It's a rogue endeavor. Everyone does whatever. As a matter of fact, the worst thing that kind of happened to the steampunk aesthetic are 1. Items became commercially available, so all costumes started to look the same. And 2. The unpolished AI art that's currently flooding the search engines. I said it before, and I'm gonna say it again. If you copy what others did, you're doing steampunk wrong. And this is the whole reason for the tagline of this channel. Make it your way. So, does steampunk have an identity crisis? Well, yes and no. Most of the steampunk creators all do the same thing in regards to trope stacking, that being combining history and pop culture tropes. Whether these tropes are derived from cyberpunk or gothic horror is, well, kind of irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. I prefer the cyberpunk in the past over fantasy tropes, but in the end, writers go where their audiences take them, especially if you want to make a career out of it. I got people telling me I should include more airships and other stereotypical tropes of the genre. Will I? Well, if I can think of an adventure for it. And that brings me to the intentions of my own series. The reason why I created the Association of Ishtar as a multiverse was to invite other authors to help create concepts for worlds that readers can visit. Worlds that are cyberpunk in the past but go beyond the confines of the Victorian themes and apply the tools for the steampunk genre to other time periods and parts of the world. And for that reason, I also put together workshops on how to write for this series and my interpretations of the steampunk genre. And that brings me to my last point. I have mentioned this opinion various times, but I have yet to make a dedicated video on it. The importance of Western on the steampunk genre. I might even go that far to say that without Western there might not have been steampunk to begin with. People forget that not only was it one of the most popular genres for a very long time, but by the end it contained elements of both not only American cinema but European and Japanese storytelling as well. As a matter of fact, a samurai western is currently taking Netflix by storm, Blue Eye Samurai, which interestingly has a connection to the steampunk community. But I might make a separate review on that at some point. Western has led to another trope stacking genre called Weird West, a blend of fantasy, horror and sci-fi combined with classic Western that found a resurgence in gaming recently. Think of games like Hard West 1 and 2, Blood West, Weird West, even Red Dead Redemption flirted with it. And of course my personal favorite game at the moment, Hunt Showdown. And of course we see here cowboys wielding ray guns and other futuristic weaponry while fighting aliens and ghosts. Kinda sounds familiar, doesn't it? Anyway, why westerns, you ask? Well, apart from the life on the frontier filled with conflict between Native American tribes and bandits, we also see the tendrils of federal government finding its way to these independent settlements, be it through corporate interest or the foreign carpetbaggers trying to usurp power in these communities. Both the shows, Hell on Wheels and Deadwood, portray this process from pioneering communities to civilized settlements very well. It also plays into the whole democracy versus parentalism theme that Latter brings up in his own videos. Quite frankly, it probably fits the theme of this book very well too. I wrote the main character in my first book as a Western character, though it takes place in Dover, England. Now, I discussed him in his own video, so go check that out. As a matter of fact, a recent short story of mine that was published in Silent and Starsong issue 2 is called Castles, Cigarettes and a Cachet Full of Carbines, and it's also heavily Weird West inspired. Now, is this really that special of a combination? No, not really. Western has a massive influence in sci-fi in general, from the obvious Firefly series to my favorite Star Trek adaptation Deep Space Nine. Not to mention all those 90s cartoons. Not so Western inspired is our new book, Anwin, Adventures in Responsible Dual Ownership, that's currently in pre-order on Amazon. It has art by the always amazing Johan Alexander, and it's a great book for the dark period of the year. And with that, I'm gonna bid you adieu. If you want to learn more about steampunk and its various iterations, don't forget to check out our other videos on this channel, and we also have video tie-ins to our books and comics, like our recent alt history video, The World of Atlas, that is about colonial wars in India and how these led to the development of the world's first space program. And of course, if you enjoy, don't forget to like and subscribe and leave a comment, and as always, make things your way. Good night.